Okay, welcome back. Now I'm going to be running through a series of PowerPoint overhead slides here. And because there will be people listening to this presentation at home on their computers or as an MP3 download, I'm going to actually read out what's on the PowerPoint overheads. Might be a bit boring for you in the audience, but as people at home aren't able to read these, then of course they're going to need to know what it is that I'm talking about. Okay, so let's just look at some basic statistics in regards to chronic pain. At the moment, 1 in every 5 Australians experiences chronic pain, 1 in every 6 Europeans or British people experience it, and an astonishing figure of 1 in every 3 Americans experiences chronic pain, which I think is just a phenomenal amount of people. We need to be wondering what has gone wrong to produce such high amounts of people in chronic pain. And the other interesting thing is that the countries that are so badly afflicted with chronic pain are primarily the developed countries. If we look at countries like India and China, massive amounts of people involved in those countries engaging in fairly heavy lifting from very young ages right through to old age. Those countries and those cultures have nowhere near the amount of chronic pain that our Western developed countries have. And this kind of suggests that certainly something's gone wrong, but it's probably not the human body that's gone wrong. We see human bodies in other cultures working vigorously, and usually these other cultures have no sense of OH&S principles or regulations. There's no awareness of the right way to lift or the wrong way to lift. People just get in and do it. And I don't want to glorify developing countries or the cultures or the problems that they have inherent in those particular countries. But one of the problems that they don't have to grapple with in anywhere near the same way as what we in the West and developed countries have to grapple with is chronic pain. So something's clearly gone wrong, but I don't think it's the human body. I think what's gone wrong is more how we in developed countries have begun to conceptualize chronic pain, the ways that we make sense of it, the explanatory systems, etc. As an example, in the developed countries, we have what can be referred to as the pain industry. And the pain industry is made up of all those practitioners and health practitioners and therapists that work with chronic pain as a massive issue that it is. It's primarily run by physiotherapists. However, obviously physicians, chiropractors, a whole range of alternative body practitioners, and even psychologists are involved on the periphery of the pain industry, primarily not as therapists in order to try to eradicate chronic pain, but to simply help people to learn to adjust to being in chronic pain or to learn to cope with chronic pain better. Okay, why do I refer to the hidden psychology of pain? Well, I think psychology has basically been hidden from the conversation about chronic pain for the last 50 or so years. As I explained this morning, this was not always the case. If you go back to, say, the 30s, the 40s and the 50s, then the introduction of psychology into discussions around a whole range of chronic health issues, including pain, was far less unusual than what it's become in the last 50 years. So psychology has been hidden from this conversation. The pain industry that's developed, like I said, has been mostly run by physiotherapists and physicians, and they have not sought to bring psychology into the discussion at all. The other reason why I refer to psychology as being hidden is that the relevant psychological factors are often hidden from our conscious awareness. This is a theme that I'll be discussing further as we go on. David B. Morris, who's a professor of both medicine and English at the University of Virginia, has described chronic pain as being the visible crisis at the centre of contemporary life. And I think that's a very apt description. this leads on, well, the medicalisation of chronic pain and the physical way of approaching chronic pain and trying to make sense of it leads on to a whole raft of issues and problems. When the medical profession deals with this problem and makes sense of chronic pain in terms of the biomechanics of the body and even the physiology of the body, then it leads to interventions such as the prescription of opioid painkillers. Opioid painkillers the prescription of these have increased by a factor of 50 in the last 10 years alone. This is an enormous increase. And in Australia, what this has resulted in is a 15-fold increase in the deaths involving opioid painkillers in the last 10 years. There are now more people in Australia dying from opioid painkillers than dying from heroin. And in America, there are now more people dying from these painkillers than die from car accidents. So this is a phenomenal amount of people. What this makes clear is that the medical treatment of chronic pain is simply not adequate or helpful for many sufferers. Now, psychology has a great deal to offer. Where the pain industry has allowed psychology into the equation has been primarily as a strategy using cognitive behaviour therapy to help people to adjust to being in chronic pain. But as you'll be learning over the course of this workshop, I'd suggest that psychology has a great deal more to offer than just helping people to learn to cope with being in pain. And of course, there's a range of realities that go along with psychological interventions, and the first, probably most important one, is that it has very few adverse side effects. Nobody that I know of has ever died as a result of a psychological intervention for chronic pain. However, the amount of people that are dying as a result of the medical interventions of chronic pain is ever escalating. Okay. As I mentioned before, Professor Fran Alexander, who died in 1964, was a key player in basically taking the theories of Sigmund Freud, the originator of psychoanalysis, and applying these theories to the range of issues referred to as chronic health problems. Franz Alexander didn't specifically address chronic pain, but he certainly developed a theoretical model to approach chronic health issues. And when Professor John Sarno began his work with chronic pain in the early 1970s, he basically was taught by a psychoanalytic psychologist colleague of his, Stanley Owen, to use Professor Alexander's approach and apply it to chronic pain as opposed to chronic health issues. You'll find that there's often in this literature there's a mention of the term psychogenic pain. And psychogenic simply means pain which is caused by psychological factors. Now, it certainly does not imply that the pain is imaginary or all in your head. When we're dealing with psychogenic pain, the pain is entirely real, but it's resulting from psychological factors rather than from physical factors. There's a notion of somatization that still exists in psychiatry. The idea of somatization is different to psychogenic pain that I'll be describing, or the model that I'll be describing, in that somatization assumes that there's not a real biological pathway to producing the physical pain, whereas what I'll be presenting to you today clearly suggests that there are very real biological pathways which are producing chronic pain. However, as per the nature of psychogenic, the nature of that term, the assumption is that there are psychological factors which are triggering and utilising very real biological pathways to produce the chronic pain. So I need to make it very clear right from the outset here that this is not a suggestion that the pain is all psychological, and it's certainly not a suggestion that the pain is all in your head. The reality is that most health issues, including chronic pain, are multifactorial. It's very rare for there ever to be one single cause of any kind of health issue, and I think that's really the case with chronic pain as well. there are multiple factorial elements that go into creating chronic pain. The reality is in the last 50 years that psychological explanations have fallen out of favour. This has resulted from the increase in impressive medical technology. And what Professor Sarno has done, and what I'm hoping to do as well, is to reintroduce psychology back into the discussion of chronic pain. Now, this is not to say that biology or physiology is unimportant in chronic pain or any other chronic health issue. Obviously, it is important. We are physical beings as well as psychological beings. However, what we're arguing for here is basically a reintroduction of psychology back into the discussion of chronic pain. It's quite likely that both physical and psychological factors play some kind of contributing role to producing chronic pain. And when we're talking about what is primarily psychogenic pain, then we're talking about the emphasis being on the psychological factors that are probably using very real biological pathways to produce a very real physical pain. And what that means is that when it's primarily psychogenic, there's probably relatively few physical causes or contributors to the chronic pain. And then, of course, there's pain which results from a recent injury, which is not going to be referred to as a chronic pain. It's going to be referred to as an acute pain. And because it's resulted from an injury, maybe you've fallen off a ladder or something like that, then obviously there's a very large physical component to that kind of pain, and there's a relatively small psychological component. So we can view these both psychological and physical causes for a pain as being somewhere along a continuum. At the one end of the continuum, we have primarily psychological causes. At the other end of the continuum, we have primarily physical causes. Now, in a press release in 2001, the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK stated that over 50% of patients in specialities such as cardiology, neurology, gynecology, gastroenterology, dentistry, rheumatology have symptoms for which there is no clear-cut physical explanation. In addition, there are a whole range of perplexing disorders with unexplained physical symptoms, things like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, low back pain, tinnitus, irritable bowel syndrome, premenstrual syndrome, and atypical chest pain, for which psychological intervention is the treatment of choice. Just last year, 2012, Michael Sharp, who's a professor of psychological medicine at University of Oxford, was in the media for stating or advocating that psychological factors must be taken into account when approaching the broad range of medically unexplained symptoms. Now, this accounts for 1/4 of all medical visits. So it may very well be the case in that 3/4 of medical visits or visits to GPs, a clear physical explanation can be found for the problem. However, in a full 1/4 of visits to GPs and specialists, there's simply no medical explanation that can be found that would explain people's symptoms. Based on literature, on research literature, psychosocial factors are estimated to explain around 70% of the differences between an injury that eventually results in chronic pain and an injury from which the person eventually recovers. So suggesting 70% is a very large psychological factor, large contribution. Research published by Petrie and Weinman in 2012 indicates that how we make sense of any particular health problem or condition, we call how we make sense of a health condition a cognitive attribution, has a large role in determining our level of disability, the amount of pain we experience from it, and the ultimate outcome. So pain attributions are actually more important in determining the outcome than is the actual severity of the condition itself. The sense that we make of chronic pain, our beliefs about its causes, and our expectations of its course can be modified through straightforward psychoeducational processes. And it's very important that we do this because, as Petrie demonstrated through his research, how we make sense of what's produced the pain condition or the health condition to start off with has a very large role in determining the outcome of that condition, whether we get better or not. Professor of Medicine David Cherry in 2003 stated, and he's the former convener of the Australian Pain Society, stated that the psychological factors which are relevant to chronic pain are often operating at an unconscious level. So the unconscious factors that may be contributing to chronic pain include such things as psychological trauma, and this may be trauma relating to childhood or teenage year experiences, or it could be trauma relating to experiences that are not so distant in somebody's past. And when we're talking about trauma, it makes sense to distinguish between what are referred to as the big T trauma events. So these are the experiences in which a person has nearly been killed, or where they've witnessed other people that have been killed or nearly killed. It includes experiences such as combat experience, car accidents, bashing, attempted murder experiences, rapes, etc. So the really very dramatic adverse life experiences are referred to as being the big T traumas. And we can think of a trauma as existing on a continuum. We have the big T traumas down the far end of the continuum, and down the lesser extreme end of the continuum we have what are referred to as small T traumas, and often simply referred to as adverse life events. Now these small T traumas can include things like humiliation experiences, an experience of being put down by parents or adults throughout your childhood, being socially excluded by peers at school, being bullied in the workplace, etc. And these small T traumas, while they're not life-threatening, what the research indicates is that there's an accumulative effect of many small T traumas. So if somebody has gone through a childhood, maybe they haven't been sexually abused or physically beaten to that extent, but there's been a whole lot of put-down experiences throughout their childhood, then there's an accumulative effect of this adverse life experience. What research indicates is that the psychological impact of this accumulative effect can be just as powerful as one or two of the big T traumas. So even though they're referred to as small T traumas, this is not to suggest that they're trivial experiences or the emotional consequences of these experiences are in any way trivial for people. So keep in mind that psychological trauma exists on a continuum. What other sorts of unconscious factors can contribute to chronic pain? Emotional conflicts and dilemmas. In my book, The Hidden Psychology of Pain, I gave an example of a man who experienced extreme chest pain for about 3 years prior to my meeting with him. And the chest pain was so extreme that he'd been in and out of hospital with the specialists, the physicians, and his whole family believing that he was having serious cardiac events, and in fact to such an extent that they believed that he was going to die. And when I met this man, he had been in this pain for around 3 years. He'd had to cease working. His work involved a degree of physicality. He was unable to do that. And he was, for the most part, somewhat disabled by the pain. When I discussed with him what had been going on for him at the time when the pain began, he revealed to me that he was at the forefront of the local protest movement that was objecting to Australia's involvement in the invasion on Iraq. Now, at the same time, this man had a son who was in the Australian Army, and his son's unit was destined to participate in the invasion on Iraq. And this created, as you'd expect, an enormous dilemma for my client. The dilemma was that, of course, he loved and respected his son. He knew that his son was a very fine young man who had high ideals of service and protecting freedoms, etc. However, at the same time, my client had the view that Australia's participation on the invasion in Iraq was purely a political stunt, if you like. He rejected the possibility that Iraq was posing any kind of military threat to its neighbours or to America, rejected the possibility that Iraq had anything to do with the September 11 bombings in America, was highly sceptical about the prospect of the weapons inspectors ever finding any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and basically believed that the whole proposed invasion on Iraq was primarily about protecting oil interests and, for political reasons that were not terribly worthy. He was highly concerned that an enormous amount of civilians were likely to get killed in the invasion, which he couldn't see any good reason for. And of particular concern, of course, to him being a father of his son, was that his son may very well be killed in the invasion, and if not killed, his son may then participate in the killing of other people in a situation which my client viewed as having no good moral basis or justification. So as you'd expect, this posed an enormous conflict and dilemma for my client, and the reality is that it had no easy answers. His son knew of his views in regards to the proposed invasion and his involvement in the protest movement. It was not something that they could really argue about. His son had sworn to obey orders and to participate in the military as he was required to do. My client knew that his son had sworn to do this and had every intention of living up to his oath. There was really nothing that could be done about this situation at all. There was basically an unsolvable problem. And while my client was aware of this dilemma at a conscious level, at a very deep unconscious level, there was a depth of despair that was even larger than what he was aware of. This is a really good example of the kind of dilemma or conflict operating at a fairly unconscious level, which has the power to generate a very real physical pain. How do we know that this is what was generating this man's pain? Well, as a result of us talking about it and presenting this approach to my client, within a couple of weeks, the pain in his chest went away, never to return again. Now, there'd been no physical intervention on his chest. Nothing was done physically whatsoever. The only thing that had changed for him was learning that chronic pain could have psychological causes and that intense dilemmas could be one of those unconscious psychological causes. And my client, to his credit, was very open to this possibility, and he worked with these ideas. Within a couple of weeks, he was no longer in pain. So I think really the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The fact that he got better was a very clear indicator that there were psychological factors using very real biological pathways to generate the pain for him. Other kinds of unconscious psychological factors that can be involved in the causation of chronic pain: threats to our self-concept. We all have a sense of who we are, and most of our self-concepts involve notions of us being reasonable human beings, being reasonably rational, being level-headed, being safe people to be around, etc. We may view ourselves as being loving parents, as being dutiful sons and daughters, faithful wives and husbands, etc. And the reality is that things can go on in our lives which threaten this self-concept. The client that I mentioned earlier, Max, who had the chronic back pain as a result of the sexual abuse he experienced as a child, it's quite possible that at a very deep unconscious level, Max actually had a desire to murder his brother for what he'd done to him and for the consequences that it had generated for Max. Now, at the same time, Max viewed himself as being a reasonable human being and certainly not as a potential murderer. However, it's quite possible that at a very deep unconscious level, his level of rage was so intense that there may have been some motivation and some willingness to actually murder his brother for what he'd done to him. Obviously, this possibility could never easily sit with Max's self-concept of him being a reasonable human being. And so the possibility is that, the prospect is that this threat to his self-concept was bubbling away at a less than conscious level. Also, fears that are operating at a less than conscious level. can be part of the unconscious factors generating chronic pain. These fears may relate to experiences from our childhood or teenage years. It may relate to getting into trouble from our parents, being spoken to or looked at in a certain way. And it may just turn out that your spouse or your boss has the uncanny ability to look at you in the same way, or state your name with the same emphasis on a particular syllable in the same way that your angry and abusive parent did throughout your childhood. And at an unconscious level, hearing your boss speaking to you in this way or looking to you in this particular manner can trigger a whole lot of fears that are operating from your childhood that are still there from at an unconscious level. And again, this can generate chronic pain. Repressed anger is also another means of, one of the psychological factors that could operate at an unconscious level. Again, looking at somebody like Max, as I mentioned before, it's quite possible that he may have actually at some level wanted to murder his brother, and obviously that's involving a whole lot of anger. Okay. Now, I've mentioned Professor John Sarno, and Professor Sarno refers to psychogenic pain with the following term, TMS. And his original use of the term TMS was referring to tension myositis syndrome. Tension refers to the emotional and the physical tension that can be around emotional psychological issues. Myositis refers to the muscle, and syndrome refers to the collection of symptoms which people can experience. More lately, Professor Sarno changed TMS to refer to the mind-body syndrome in recognition of the fact that many symptoms that he and I and many other mind-body therapists work with are not just pain issues relating to muscles, but in fact nerves, ligaments and tendons, as well as a whole range of different bodily systems can be involved in generating pain or experiencing pain. So it's actually a lot wider than just simply referring to muscles. So I tend to stick with the notion of TMS as referring to the mind-body syndrome. Professor Sarno recently retired just last year as the Professor of Rehab Medicine at the Rusk Institute of Medicine in New York, and also as the Professor at New York University Medical Center. He held that position from 1965 until 2012. And during that time, he worked with somewhere between 20,000 to 30,000 sufferers of chronic pain. There aren't too many people on the planet, in fact, I'm not sure if there would be any others at all, that have worked with a sample of chronic pain sufferers remotely anywhere near that volume of people. And what this means is that Professor Sarno has had, over the course of those years, a unique window of opportunity to explore what's going on with chronic pain sufferers and to see many people overcome their chronic pain as a result of simply processing information. As I said just before, TMS can relate to chronic pain of all the muscle groups. Now, in particular, it seems that the postural muscles in our back, neck and shoulders, these are the muscles that are required to keep our posture upright, seem to be particularly vulnerable to TMS pain, but it can also affect nerves and tendons and ligaments. The client that I mentioned to you before that had a chronic pain in his chest, it would seem to me that he was actually suffering from TMS pain, psychogenic pain, of the nerve which runs through his chest. Now, I came to this conclusion as a result of fracturing 3 vertebrae in my neck, I think it was about 7 years ago, in a surfing accident where I hit my head on a sandbar. I fractured 3 vertebrae in my neck, and in the process I picked up 2 disc bulges as well. Now, at the moment of impact, it felt like several thousand volts of electricity surging down my left shoulder into my left arm. And I knew immediately that I hadn't damaged my arm or my shoulder, and that the pain was coming about as a result of nerve damage which I'd done from the fracturing of my neck. About a month later, I was back at work and having morning tea, and I took a big stretch backwards, and I basically flexed my neck backwards, and in that moment I got an intense burst of pain in my chest, and it felt like a large meat cleaver had been driven into the middle of my chest, to such an extent that it took my breath away for several minutes. Now, I knew that I'd done absolutely no damage to my chest whatsoever, and never have done. And also knew that the nerves that were damaged in my fracturing of the 3 vertebrae in my neck actually covered the chest region, as well as the arm and my hands. And I still had fingers that were at that time still relatively numb as a result of the nerve damage. So knowing that basically what I'd done is the nerves had been damaged in the accident by the vertebra bending out of their normal position, impacting on the nerve and producing damage. That's what gave me the intense pain in my shoulder and arm at the point of injury. And a month later, when I flexed back, stretched backwards, I obviously impacted again on the nerves that were still somewhat damaged, and it sent this referred pain into the middle of my chest. So I had very clear evidence of nerve pain. And as it turned out, the client that I was seeing next for the very first time was this man that presented with an extreme pain in his chest. In fact, in exactly the same locations where I had my pain, only a few minutes earlier. So when this man was telling me about the pain in his chest, he also mentioned that he had a particular physical deformity in the bones of his chest, and that he had a very large concave right in the middle of his chest. He'd been born with this concave. However, the medical opinion was, as a way of trying to explain why he was experiencing this chest pain in the previous 3 years, the medical explanation was that his heart simply didn't have enough room to function without being in pain. Therefore, it was generating the discomfort in his chest. What this failed to recognise was that this man, at the point when I met him, was probably in his mid to late 50s. And that means that he'd spent all but 3 years of his life, let's say around 54, 55 years of his life, with the chest deformity, but without being in pain. So there's no logical reason why the chest deformity would all of a sudden produce this pain in his chest, whereas it hadn't produced it at all at any other time across his life. So to my mind, there was clearly something else going on here. The fact that I just experienced my own nerve chest pain in a fairly dramatic way alerted me to the possibility that this man might also be experiencing a pain in his chest resulting from nerves. And to me, this was evidence, very good evidence, that TMS can relate to nerves as much as it can relate to pain. So it can generate very real pain in nerves, in muscles, as well as tendons and ligaments. Now, chronic pain patients usually have a history of other tension-induced conditions. So it's not at all unusual for people suffering from chronic pain to have also experienced heartburn, pre-ulcer symptoms, hiatus hernia, irritable bowel syndrome, colitis, spastic colon, tension headaches, migraine, eczema, or any of the other raft of mind-body health issues. Now, when people experience a cluster of these mind-body health issues, which are often recognised as having a large psychological contribution, and when these kind of symptoms and conditions exist in a cluster, again, it's a pretty fair indicator that what we're talking about is distressed emotion at some level resulting in these kind of symptoms. The observation is all these conditions that I've mentioned are all highly treatable with a psychoeducational approach. So TMS can include disorders of the following symptoms: the gastrointestinal system, the circulatory system, the skin system, the immune system, the genital and urinary system, and the cardiac system. Any part of the anatomy relating to these systems within the body can experience TMS pain, chronic pain, and/or other kinds of chronic health issues. Now, I need to emphasise again that TMS pain is entirely real. There's no suggestion here that it's imaginary just because we're talking about psychology. But the suggestion is that the pain or the health condition primarily doesn't result from structural pathologies of the body. And the reason why this can be asserted is that research demonstrates no causal relationship between structural pathology and chronic pain. From research, we know that most people over the age of 40, in fact this involves around 60 to 70% of the people over the age of 40, have multiple sites of disc pathology in their spine, which are observable in x-rays and scans, but they have no pain whatsoever. And the spine begins to deteriorate after the age of around 20. So between the ages of 20 to 40, again, it's statistically normal. Most people actually have at least one site of spinal pathology. So being statistically normal, you'd have to question why such spine pathologies are referred to as abnormalities of the spine in X-ray reports and scan reports. They're basically statistically normal. Okay. What happens is, the reason why we've wound up with this perception that spine pathology is going to be producing chronic pain is as follows. Imagine two people, let's call them Harry and Jack. Let's say they're two middle-aged men. Let's say Harry and Jack are both office workers. They don't use their bodies physically for a living, but on the weekend they're keen gardeners. Let's say on this particular weekend they're both out there in their backyard doing some landscape gardening. So they're moving around wheelbarrow loads of soil, rocks, lugging around sleepers, etc. Let's say one of the men, Harry, winds up with an extreme back pain. Now, being a normal man, Harry's probably going to wait for a couple of weeks before he goes off to see a GP. But if the pain persists and persists and the weeks turn into a month and then becomes 2 months and he's still in pain, then there's a reasonable chance that Harry will ultimately go along and see a GP. Now, being a normal man and being a normal person over the age of 40, when an X-ray is done to examine Harry's back, the X-ray results are more than likely going to show that he's got at least one or more sites of disc pathology. Now, this disc pathology happens to be in the same part of his anatomy as the pain that he's experiencing. So it's a pretty logical conclusion to assume that the disc pathology is actually producing the pain. It makes a fair bit of logical sense, an intuitive sense. Everybody's going to wind up being quite satisfied with that as an explanation. The GP will be satisfied with that. Harry's likely to be quite satisfied with that explanation. Harry may be advised by the GP to simply rest. He may be put on some painkillers. He may be referred off to a physiotherapist or a chiropractor for physical therapy. And if he is referred on to physical therapy, then there's going to be a reinforcement of the whole notion that he's suffering back pain because of what he's done to his spine. Okay, now let's have a look at his next door neighbour, Jack. Jack didn't injure himself on that particular weekend. He didn't hurt his back. If Jack went along to a GP, in fact he wouldn't do this, but let's say if he did what he wouldn't do, he went along to the GP and requested an X-ray, the X-ray results have a statistically high chance of showing that Jack also has multiple sites of disc pathology simply because he's a relatively normal person over the age of 40, and most people in that age group have multiple sites of disc pathology. Now, because this doesn't happen, Jack doesn't go to the GP and get an X-ray, the GP is never confronted by people like Jack, and the GP is never confronted with this anomaly that, here we are, hang on, actually looking at an X-ray of somebody that has multiple sites of disc pathology, but they're saying they're not in pain. Now, because the GP is never confronted by that reality, because people that are not in pain don't go to the GP and request scans or X-rays, the physician is not forced to challenge the model that he or she has in his or her head. The model being that structural pathology of the spine, as in disc pathologies, is going to produce chronic back pain. Because the GP is never confronted by people like Jack, he or she never has to actually challenge this particular model, and there's a flow-on effect of this reality. chiropractors and physiotherapists are never going to have to challenge this model either, this way of understanding, because they're also not confronted by people like Jack who aren't in pain. They're only ever confronted by people like Harry who are in pain. And of course, Harry, being a relatively normal person over the age of 40, is also a person that carries multiple disc pathologies. So the faulty notion that spine pathology produces chronic pain keeps on being reinforced within the treatment industry, within the medical profession, within the pain industry, physiotherapists, chiropractors, etc. And this notion keeps on being reinforced. It keeps on being reinforced with patients, and it keeps on being reinforced in the popular media. And as a culture, we wind up with a very solid sense that people experience chronic pain as a result of spine pathology. However, as I said before, when we actually look at what the research has to say, this whole model, this assumption that spine pathology produces chronic pain begins to fall apart. It simply doesn't hold water. If researchers take 100 people off the street, let's say these people are all over the age of 40, they ask them to participate in their research. Let's say all these people report that they don't have any back pain, neck or shoulder pain. They're absolutely fine, thanks very much. And the researcher then conducts x-rays or scans on these people's spines. They're going to find that around 60 to 70% of these people actually have got multiple sites of disc pathology. And this is what the research community knows. However, it seems to be difficult for this information to filter from the research community. It exists in research medical journals, but it doesn't seem to filter easily into the treatment industry, into clinicians, into GPs, physiotherapists, chiropractors or psychologists. And because it doesn't filter easily into the treatment industry, it certainly doesn't filter into our popular culture and the mainstream way of making sense of chronic pain. This is very unfortunate because, as I said before, a faulty notion keeps on being reinforced by the pain industry. And a large part of the problem and part of the epidemic of chronic pain is misinformation. And to a certain extent, in varying degrees, we've all internalized this misinformation. And it's the misinformation that makes us all vulnerable to suffering from chronic pain. I alluded to it earlier, perhaps I should have specified, there's a very important difference between acute pain and chronic pain. Acute pain is the pain that we feel that results from a recent injury. Now, it's not unusual if we've injured ourselves with either a soft tissue injury or a hard tissue injury, the normal kind of biological response to that injury is inflammation and pain. And both the inflammation and the pain exists in order to basically slow us down so that we will protect the injured part of our body so as to allow the natural healing process to take place. Soft tissue injuries tend to heal within a matter of 2 to 3 weeks, give or take some time according to other factors such as general health status, age, etc. And hard tissue injuries such as bones being broken tend to heal within about 3 months. All of the bones that I broke in my car accident, in particularly my leg, my ankles, healed within around 3 months. And when I fractured 3 vertebrae in my neck, I asked the neurosurgeon early on in the recovery process whether I might be able to play football again, and he said, well, it should take around 3 months for recovery to happen, and let's have an x-ray in 3 months' time, and if the bones are knitted back together again, then there's probably no good reason why you shouldn't play football again. And what I noticed was that in the first couple of weeks I was in a great deal of pain. You know, it was difficult just simply to move my neck at all. My neck was incredibly stiff. After a couple of weeks the pain began to ease up. Of course, being very stiff and in pain basically immobilized my neck and my head, which allowed the recovery work to happen. As the weeks went on, beyond the first 2 or 3 weeks, the pain and the stiffness began to ease up. And within around the week of the 3-month mark, I noticed that I was back to nearly a full rotation of movement in my neck. Not quite entirely full, but pretty close to being a full rotation. And I wasn't experiencing any pain. And sure enough, the x-ray showed that the bones had knitted back together again, and I was given the green light to play football. which I then played for about another 3 or 4 seasons. In fact, I did the injury in early January, and I was playing football again that year in early April or mid-April. And believe me, I'm no Iron Man. I don't like pain. I'm not particularly tough, but I've never had any ongoing neck problems despite playing football with a relatively recent neck injury like that. I've never had any whiplash problems or any problems like that whatsoever. And it's not because I'm tough, and it's not because I've just simply gritted my teeth and pushed through the pain barrier. I simply haven't had ongoing pain as a result. So my neck injury was a pretty good example of an acute pain which resulted from an injury. Beyond the 3-month mark, if I was still in pain in my neck, then my pain would then have qualified as a chronic pain. Now, physical explanations make a whole lot of sense when we're talking about acute pain, as it did for my neck injury. However, physical explanations, as borne out by the research evidence that I just detailed before, actually bears no relationship to chronic pain whatsoever. Structural pathology of the spine, of the neck, shoulders, etc., more than likely exists within most of us. However, it's purely correlated to the fact that we may or may not be in chronic pain. It's not causally related to chronic pain. It's certainly causally related to acute pain, but it's not causally related to chronic pain, as borne out by the research evidence that I described. Okay. Now, the suggestion, as I said before, the suggestion is that chronic pain results from psychological factors which can utilize very real biological pathways to produce physiological changes that result in pain. And the primary one of these physiological changes is a process called ischemia. Ischemia is a mild oxygen deprivation experienced by both muscles and nerves, and it can result in very painful cramps and spasms and odd nerve experiences. Now, a muscle only needs to have a decrease of the oxygen supply by as little as 3% to produce ischemia in the muscle, which will be experienced as a very painful cramp or spasm. Now, oxygen is obviously carried in the blood supply, and around the blood vessels which carry the blood out to muscles, nerves, and all parts of the body is a layer of muscle, a layer of connective tissue, and surrounding that is a layer of muscle called vascular smooth muscle. And vascular smooth muscle, like any muscle, has the ability to constrict or to loosen up. The suggestion here is that, and of course the vascular smooth muscles are basically controlling our body temperature all the time without us being consciously aware of it. It's under the control of a part of the central nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. This happens automatically. Now, we know that this happens if you're, say, out in a snowfield and you're in the middle of a blizzard and you're inadequately dressed for it, you don't have a heavy jacket on, etc., and you don't have gloves on, and it's basically a life-threatening condition. What will happen is that your autonomic nervous system will constrict the blood supply to your extremities, to your feet and your hands, in order to concentrate the blood supply in your torso so as to protect your vital organs. Your brain is figuring we can afford to go without fingers or toes, but we really can't afford to go without the vital organs operating and being well protected. And how it does this is by constricting the blood vessels, constricting the vascular smooth muscles around the blood vessels which take the blood to your extremities, to your hands and feet, and opening up the blood vessels, loosening the vascular smooth muscles surrounding the blood vessels which take blood to your torso. So as a result, a concentration of blood and therefore warmth results in your torso, protecting the vital bodily organs, and unfortunately for your fingers and toes, they can be sacrificed in order to make sure that you survive the experience. Another example is if you've just had a large meal, you're driving away from a restaurant and a dog runs out on the road in front of you, you will immediately hit the brakes and turn the steering wheel so as to avoid hitting the dog. Now, because you've just had a large meal, there's a good chance that a lot of the blood supply is being sent to the muscles in your stomach, which are activated in order for digestion to happen. And in a nanosecond, your autonomic nervous system will recognize that this is a dangerous situation. It will trigger what's called the fight or flight response, which creates a whole range of physiological changes in your body. Adrenaline will be released from your adrenal glands. Your heart will pump very quickly. And your autonomic nervous system, again, will clamp down on the muscles surrounding the vascular smooth muscles surrounding the blood vessels, taking blood to your stomach, and it will open up, loosen the vascular smooth muscles and the blood vessels that take blood to your arms and your legs. And all of a sudden, your arms and legs in a nanosecond will become full of blood, which allows you to use the muscles in a vigorous and very quick manner in order to hit the brakes and turn the steering wheel so as to avoid running over the dog. So it's kind of the opposite of what happens in a snowstorm. So these kind of experiences are normal. Our body temperature is usually being maintained and regulated through this process of opening and closing blood vessels via constriction and loosening of the vascular smooth muscles. And the notion is that the ischemia process happens with chronic pain, in that particularly the postural muscles in the back, neck and shoulders are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of a decrease in blood supply. And the autonomic nervous system is able to constrict the vascular smooth muscles, which take blood and therefore oxygen to your postural muscles in your back. It only needs to be decreased by as little as 3% to produce ischemia, and all of a sudden you're going to wind up in truckloads of pain in your back. Now, another thing that Professor Sarno discovered early on in his career was that 3 different kinds of interventions all tend to alleviate chronic pain, although they won't get rid of chronic pain. So the application of heat or cold packs will often alleviate pain, as will, having a hot bath or a hot shower. I've even had a client report that the first time that she got into a solarium, her chronic back pain that had dogged her for years melted away as she became warmer and warmer. Another thing that tends to create some alleviation for chronic pain is massage, and also physical movement tends to decrease chronic pain, at least alleviate it in the short term. Now, the only thing that heat and cold packs, massage and physical movement have in common is that they all increase circulation in the pained area. So if I've got a sore muscle in my bicep, I put a heat pack on it, it's obviously going to increase the temperature by bringing blood into that area, and with the blood comes oxygen. Paradoxically, a cold pack will do the same thing. It will actually increase the surface temperature of that muscle, and again, as a result of having the temperature increased, blood and therefore oxygen will come back into that pained muscle. If I massage my bicep, the massage action is going to bring blood and therefore oxygen back into the pained area. And also, if I use my bicep, if I move my arm in a gentle manner, that's also going to increase the circulation and therefore bring blood and oxygen back into that sore muscle. And each of these interventions will often temporarily alleviate the pain simply by increasing the blood supply and the oxygen supply to these muscles. Now, what this suggests is that the problem to begin with in chronic pain is, in fact, a deprivation of oxygen in those muscles. If interventions which increase the oxygen supply to the treated area result in a decrease in the pain, then it obviously suggests that the problem to begin with was not enough oxygen in that sore area. Now, the mind or brain, as I said before, can increase or decrease the blood supply to any part of the body. For example, in the snowstorm, when the fight or flight response is happening in a near car accident. Also under hypnosis, I've seen examples of people in a hypnotic state with a thermometer in each hand. The hypnotic suggestion has been given to them to raise the temperature of their left hand and to decrease the temperature of their right hand. Within a couple of minutes, the thermometer shows the temperatures have changed according to the hypnotic suggestion. Next, the hypnotic suggestion will be to reverse the hands, and again, the temperature will change in those hands, as demonstrated with the thermometers. Now, TMS-induced ischemia causes no permanent damage to the soft tissues involved, although it can be extremely painful. The oxygen deprivation to the muscles, the nerves and tendons is generally nowhere near sufficient to cause cellular damage to any of those body cells. So even though it's extremely painful, it tends not to result in permanent damage to the soft tissues involved. Mild ischemia is highly reversible. And I guess this is what is seen when we see people actually recovering from chronic pain, such as Max and the other gentleman that I mentioned, that had the chronic pain in his chest. Obviously, their chronic pain was reversible. They wound up not being in pain, and there's a very good chance that what was going on for them was simply this mild ischemia process, which is obviously very good news. Now, if we want to, I guess the obvious question is to ask, well, why would the mind or brain choose to produce pain via ischemia? It doesn't help us in any way to wind up in chronic pain. It doesn't improve our chances of survival. It has no evolutionary value. There seems to be no good reason for our mind or brain to produce pain within ourselves. And if we want to make sense of why that would be, we need to leave physical explanations behind, simply because there is no good physical explanation as to why our mind or brain would choose to produce pain within our own body via ischemia. And what this means is that if we want to make sense of why this would be happening, we need to start exploring psychological explanations. Now, sometimes when I just mention psychology to people in regards to chronic pain, there's the fear that I'm going to be saying to them that psychology means that the pain is all in your head. And I hope that what this discussion has demonstrated is that, far from being the case, I actually believe and would suggest to anybody suffering from chronic pain that the pain is actually in the part of your body where you feel it. You know, it's in your back or your neck or your shoulder, or in my case, in my groin. It's definitely not in your head, and it's not imaginary, even though psychology has a very important role to play in it. Another important point to raise about this whole issue of whether the pain is in the head is to talk about some of the neurology of pain and neurology of chronic pain. With every single physical experience that we have, let's say if we step on a nail, our brain is highly involved in making sense of that nerve experience and coming to the conclusion that pain is the appropriate sensation to experience. This sounds a bit odd in that we tend to think that the brain has a direct perception of pain, and we need to only step on a nail and of course we're going to experience pain. However, neurologically speaking, this is simply not the case. There are no such things as pain signals that are sent from pain nerves. No such things exist. Clearly there are nerves in our skin and spread throughout our body, and there are nerve messages that are sent up through the central nervous system, through the spinal column and up into the brain. However, these are simply alarm messages. They're not pain messages. And not all alarm messages need to result in pain. So particular parts of the brain, which I've detailed in, I think it's Appendix 2 of The Hidden Psychology of Pain, particular parts of the brain, primarily the insular and the anterior cingulate cortex, receive the nerve messages and take into account a whole range of information, primarily about the context of what's going on, in order to arrive at a conclusion that pain is the appropriate sensation to experience. And in a sense, what this means is that pain is more of an opinion that the brain arrives at rather than being a necessary sensation. That sounds odd, But if you read Appendix 2 of my book, you'll get a sense of why this could be the case. It's too complicated for me to go into a great deal of detail in this forum about. So I'd urge you to read Appendix 2 of my book. The brain, as I said, the brain is involved in arriving at a certain conclusion, and it takes into account the context. This is really clearly seen in battle situations. So in the First World War, in the trenches of France, where men had a very poor chance of surviving battle experiences, and at various times throughout the First World War, Australian soldiers were in the trenches for weeks and months on end without being relieved, and of course every additional moment that they're in the trenches, their chances of surviving the experience diminished. And what that meant was that to receive a wound, an injury, could actually be a ticket to survival. If the injury was substantial enough to ensure that they weren't going to be returned from hospital back into the front line again, then receiving an injury could be their ticket to survival and their way out of the war, and ensuring that they're going to survive the whole experience and live to tell the tale. And what has been seen in each of the wars, obviously in the First World War as well, is that soldiers that are injured in battle, firstly, many of them won't even notice that they're injured until the battle's over, because their mind or brain is so preoccupied with focusing on the context of the situation and the cues in the situation that are essential for their survival, and for them to be doing the physical actions that are essential for their survival. The brain is way too busy to basically form an opinion that they should be in pain because they've received a bullet wound or a shrapnel wound, primarily or usually until the battle's over. Then when the brain is not preoccupied with survival is when soldiers tend to notice profuse bleeding from a leg or an arm or from their back or wherever, and they may, at that point, notice that they've been injured. If they've been severely injured, often they won't actually be experiencing pain. Soldiers in the First World War were found to often be in a celebratory mood, quite happy, as a result of experiencing a fairly serious injury, because, as I said before, it increased their chances. This could be their ticket home, which is increasing their chances of actually surviving the war. Other researchers have noted that when similar injuries are inflicted on civilian populations to what soldiers during a battle experience, civilian populations require an enormous amount more of pain-killing medication. Soldiers don't tend to need it, and it's not because they're tough, but it tends to be, they probably are tough, but that's not the primary reason. But it tends to be mostly because, number one, their mind is too busy trying to do what they need to do to stay alive in order to have the time and the space available to form the opinion that they should be in pain from an injury. And number two, the injury itself is likely to be their ticket to survival. And so there's a very strong social context related to that. And the meaning of the injury or the meaning of what has happened to them is very important and can help the soldier to actually not experience pain. Now, if the same injury was inflicted on a person in a hunting accident, so they'd been shot at close range by one of their hunting friends, there's a pretty good chance that they'll be in a whole lot of pain, be a whole lot more pain than a soldier. So the context and the meaning that they derive from the experience is extremely different compared to a soldier in the trenches of the First World War. And there's a very good chance that the hunting accident victim's going to be in a whole lot more pain. Now, this is all part of the information that the brain is taking into account while it's also receiving nerve messages and alarm messages from the part of the body that's been injured. So your brain, in addition to receiving the nerve messages, is also taking account of the meaning of the injury and the meaning of the whole context, what it actually means to the person. This is why football players, you know, in professional levels of AFL and rugby league, and probably in American gridiron as well, I would imagine, football players have been known to finish playing games with broken legs and broken arms and broken ribs and not be debilitated by the pain. Again, yeah, okay, they're tough people, but that's not the primary explanation. It's simply because the context of the situation, the meaning of the situation involved, their brain has not settled yet on an opinion they should be in pain. They may very well wind up in a whole lot of pain after the end of the game, but as long as the game's still on, as long as they can still run and kick and do what they need to do, it's a common report that they actually wind up not being in such extreme pain. Okay, so psychology is obviously what I'm saying. Psychology is very important in us trying to make sense of why our mind/brain would produce chronic pain. I think we're just about due for a break. So when we come back, I will start talking about the psychology of chronic pain and introduce a particular model of the human psyche that helps us to make sense of this. So we'll come back in 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, see you then.